Close your eyes and imagine a city. Not the London you know, not the London with glass towers and underground trains. Imagine a city where the river smelled so bad that Parliament almost abandoned its own building. Where children as young as 5 crawled inside chimneys for a living. Where your morning drinking water came from the same river people dumped their sewage into the night before. This was London in the 1800s. And the reality of daily life there was stranger and more brutal than anything you've seen in a period drama. Subscribe and stick around. By 1800, London was home to roughly 1 million people. By 1850, that number had exploded past 2.5 million. It was the largest city on Earth, the capital of the most powerful empire in human history, and beneath the grandeur, it was rotting. Picture a typical morning for an ordinary Londoner. Not a lord or a lady, a working person. You wake before dawn in a single room that you share with your entire family. Maybe 6 people, maybe more. The walls are damp, the air smells of coal smoke and something worse. The ceiling is barely high enough to stand under. Your bed is a straw mattress crawling with lice. If you are lucky, you have a blanket. If you are not, you sleep in the clothes you'll wear all week. There is no running water, no toilet. The closest thing you have to a bathroom is a shared outdoor privy used by dozens of your neighbors, and that privy empties into a cesspit that may not have been cleared in months. Now think about the streets you step onto. In early 19th century London, the roads were unpaved in most working-class areas. Horse manure piled up everywhere. There were roughly 300,000 horses in London by mid-century, each one producing over 10 kilograms of dung per Dalton Y. But it wasn't just horse waste, human waste, butcher's offal, rotting food, dead animals, all of it sat in the gutters. In some neighborhoods, residents simply threw the contents of their chamber pots out upper windows with a shouted warning. If you didn't hear the warning in time, well, that was your problem. And here is the thing, people weren't horrified by this. This was just Tuesday. This was ordinary life. The streets were so filthy that a whole profession existed just to deal with it. Crossing sweepers, usually children. They'd sweep a path through the muck for a wealthier pedestrian in exchange for a penny. Imagine that as your job at age 7. Now let's talk about the water, because this is where it gets genuinely disturbing. London's drinking water came from the Thames, the same river that served as the city's primary sewer. By the 1850s, roughly 250 tons of human waste entered the Thames every single day, and 8 private water companies extracted drinking water from that same river and pumped it directly into people's homes. Nobody saw the connection. The dominant medical theory at the time was called miasma theory. Doctors believed diseases were spread by bad air, by foul smells, not by contaminated water. So people drank the Thames and wondered why cholera kept killing them. Cholera hit London 4 times in the 1800s, 1832, 1838, 1854, 1866. Tens of thousands of people died. The disease could kill you within hours of the first symptoms. You'd be walking to work in the morning and dead by evening. And the tragedy is that one man figured out the answer. A physician named John Snow in 1854. He traced a cholera outbreak in Soho to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. He mapped the cases, he proved the connection between the water and the disease, but almost nobody believed him. The medical establishment dismissed his findings. They clung to miasma theory for years after Snow presented his evidence. Snow died in 1858. The same year London was hit by an event so infamous it got its own name, the Great Stink. That summer, temperatures climbed above 35 degrees Celsius. The Thames dropped to record low levels, and centuries of waste baked on the exposed riverbanks under the scorching sun. The smell was indescribable. Members of Parliament soaked their curtains in chloride of lime trying to block the stench. It didn't work. They seriously considered abandoning Westminster entirely, moving the entire government away from the river. The scientist Michael Faraday had tested the Thames 3 years earlier. He dropped white cards into the water. They vanished before sinking an inch. He wrote to the Times newspaper that the whole river was, in his words, a real sewer. The Great Stink finally forced Parliament to act. They passed a bill in just 18 days funding a completely new sewer system. An engineer named Joseph Bazalgette designed it. Over 1,300 miles of underground tunnels, one of the greatest engineering projects of the 19th century. And it worked. When cholera struck again in 1866, only the one neighborhood not yet connected to the new sewers was affected. John Snow had been right all along. He just didn't live to see it proven. But here is the thing, the Great Stink and the sewer crisis were just one layer of life in this city. Let's talk about work. A typical laborer in 1800s London worked 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sundays off, if you were fortunate. Wages were barely enough to cover rent and food. A skilled worker might earn around 15 shillings a week, an unskilled laborer less than half that. And rent for even a single room in a slum could eat up a third of your income. Women worked too, overwhelmingly in domestic service. Cooks, maids, laundresses. Their days started before dawn and ended well past midnight. Many lived in their employer's house, sleeping in cramped attic rooms or small cupboards near the kitchen, separated from their own families. And the children. This is the hardest part to hear. By the 1851 census, over 500,000 children under 15 were employed across Britain. In London, children swept chimneys. Boys as young as 4 or 5 were sent up flues, sometimes barely 9 inches wide. Their knees and elbows would bleed raw against the brickwork. Master sweeps sometimes lit small fires beneath them to force them to climb faster. Some children suffocated. Some got stuck and died inside the chimney. And this was a legal, accepted profession for decades. Other children worked as mudlarks, wading through the filthy banks of the Thames at low tide, searching for anything valuable. Coins, scraps of metal, rope, bones, anything they could sell, barefoot in sewage, sometimes alongside the carcasses of animals, and worse. Then there were the toshers, children who entered the actual sewers beneath London searching for lost valuables. They navigated pitch-dark tunnels filled with methane gas that could explode if their lanterns got too close. Rats bit them, flash floods drowned them, and they went back day after day, because even a handful of scrap metal could feed a hungry family for a night. Think about that for a second. Children crawling through sewers in the dark. And this wasn't some rare horror story, this was an occupation. Now picture this, right alongside these slums, sometimes separated by a single street, stood the mansions of the wealthy. Aristocratic families maintained grand London properties, especially during the season. That was the annual round of balls, horse races, and social events. While children picked through sewage a few streets away, lords and ladies dined on French cuisine prepared by personal chefs. The contrast was staggering, and it was visible to everyone. Rich and poor walked the same streets. They just lived in different worlds. The wealthy had servants for everything. A household might employ a butler, a cook, maids, footmen, a coachman, a gardener, sometimes dozens of staff. The average upper-class woman's primary duty was paying and receiving social visits. Her entire day revolved around maintaining her family's reputation. And here is the thing that is hard to wrap your mind around. Many of the wealthiest Victorians genuinely believed the poor deserved their suffering. That poverty was a moral failing, that helping the destitute would only encourage laziness. The workhouse system was built on this belief. Workhouses were designed to be worse than the worst poverty, so that only the truly desperate would enter them. Families were separated, husbands from wives, parents from children. You wore a uniform. You worked crushing bones or picking oakum for hours. The food was deliberately terrible, thin gruel and bread. The beds were crammed together in rooms with almost no ventilation. Disease spread fast. Measles, smallpox, typhus. In some workhouses, the death rate was horrifying, and the medical care was provided by untrained inmates. Before 1863, no workhouse outside London employed a single trained nurse. But even in this darkness, people found ways to live. And this is where the story shifts. Because Londoners didn't just survive, they built communities. They found joy in the cracks between misery. The music hall was the great escape. By the 1850s, London was filled with these venues, raucous, colorful, packed with working-class audiences. Singers, comedians, acrobats, magicians. For a few pennies, you could forget the smell of the streets and the ache in your bones. Pubs were social centers, not just for drinking, but for gossip, for deals, for organizing. The working-class pub was its own kind of parliament. Street sellers filled every corner. Hot pies roasted chestnuts. Oysters, which were so abundant they were poor people's food. That is one of the strangest details. In the 1800s, oysters were cheap and plentiful, a working-class staple, not a luxury. London consumed roughly 500 million oysters a year at mid-century. Street vendors sold them from barrels on almost every corner. And then there was tea by the 1800s. Tea had become the universal drink, rich and poor alike. It was one of the few things that crossed every class boundary. The boiling water required to make tea may have accidentally saved countless lives by killing waterborne bacteria. Nobody knew that at the time. Think about that. An entire population unknowingly protecting itself from cholera simply because they liked tea. And slowly, painfully, things began to change. The reform movements of the 1830s and 40s started chipping away at the worst abuses. Factory Acts limited working hours for women and children. The Public Health Act of 1848 created local boards of health. Bazalgette's sewer system transformed the underground. Gaslight appeared on major streets starting in 1807, making London safer after dark. By the 1880s, most new working-class homes had connections to clean water and drainage. The death rate started falling. Education reforms meant fewer children in chimneys and more in classrooms. The 1870 Education Act made schooling available to all. But the change was agonizingly slow. Decades of suffering before each reform, thousands of preventable deaths before each improvement, and the most unsettling question in all of this isn't really about infrastructure or politics. It is about perception. How did people live like this and consider it normal? How did they walk past open sewers and not revolt? How did they watch children climb chimneys and call it work? The answer is the same as it has always been. Humans normalize whatever surrounds them. What is ordinary becomes invisible. The wealthy didn't see the suffering because they'd structured their world to avoid it. The poor didn't question it because they'd never known anything different. And that is the real mystery of everyday life in 1800s London. Not the filth or the disease or the cruelty. It is how quickly people adapt, how thoroughly a society can accept the unacceptable, simply because that is how things have always been. We look back now and we're horrified. We can't imagine drinking from a river full of sewage. We can't imagine sending a 5-year-old up a chimney. But the Victorians would be equally horrified by things we accept without question. That is the nature of normality. It blinds you. Charles Dickens saw it clearly. He walked those streets. He'd worked in a factory as a child himself when his father was imprisoned for debt. His novels weren't just fiction. They were dispatches from a world that most comfortable people chose not to see. He wrote about orphans and workhouses and debtors' prisons because they were right there, steps away from the opera houses and the grand hotels. The characters were made up, but the suffering was real, and it was everywhere. So the next time you turn on a tap and clean water comes out, think about that for a moment. Think about the 250 tons of waste that flowed into the Thames every day. Think about the families who drank from it. Think about the children in the sewers, the crossing sweepers, the mudlarks ankle-deep in filth. Think about how a single physician named John Snow mapped a disease and nobody listened. Think about how it took a smell so unbearable that Parliament couldn't function to finally force change. Not compassion, not evidence, not the deaths of thousands. A smell that tells you something about human nature that is worth sitting with. London survived the 1800s. It was transformed by them. The sewers beneath your feet today are still Bazalgette's design. The public health systems we take for granted were born in those cholera wards and those stinking streets. Every reform was paid for in suffering first. Every improvement was preceded by disaster. And somewhere in that pattern is a question we probably should be asking ourselves right now. What are we normalizing today? that will horrify the people who come after us. What is our great stink? What suffering are we stepping over on our way to work? The Victorians didn't know they were the Victorians. They were just people living their lives doing what seemed normal, just like us. If you found this interesting, subscribe. There is always more to explore. Thanks for watching.